Okay, wanted to thank you all for coming this afternoon. This is a big day in Amy's Doctor of Plant Health efforts here. This will be the final, her final seminar, and later on this afternoon, her final exam for the Doctor of Plant Health degree. So Amy came to us several years ago, I guess in 2017, from a bachelor's degree here at UNL. And she's been working through that time on the National Leads as a National Lead Scholar fellowship program, and working on developing remote learning modules. So she's going to be talking about that and fitting that into this rather intellectual sounding title that she's working on today. It Takes Brains: Cultivating the Learning Process for Effective Science Communication. I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thank you. All right, so thank you everybody for being here in person and on Zoom. I'm going to start off talking about some of my background. I graduated from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with my bachelor's in plant biology in 2017. And the following fall, or during that time, I worked as a teaching assistant for Dr. Don Lee for the genetics program, where I worked with genetics students in guiding their discussions during labs. And you guys need to come in. And after that, I started the Doctor of Plant Health program in 2017 in the fall, where I continued to work in science communication as an online content creator, working on the National Needs Fellowship, developing online modules for pesticide resistance management. The overall topic for this is that today agriculture faces some formidable challenges that test sustainability, competitiveness, and resilience. And the National Needs Fellowship was looking to help solve this challenge and spread learning on pesticide resistant management. So with these modules, we developed them from the over-reliance on pesticides to control agricultural pests like insects, diseases, and weeds that have caused pest populations to evolve resistance. With weeds, the number of resistant species for several herbicide sites of actions began to develop in the 1975, but you can see that it's relatively low. And as pesticide use increases, as does the resistant species for those herbicide sites of action. This chart shows the global number of weed species within the same population that are resistant to multiple modes of action. On the y-axis is the number of weed species that are resistant, and along the bottom in the x-axis you see by year. And so on this first green line, you see that early on, once again, it didn't show a lot of populations that had resistance to more than one type of herbicide. But as herbicide use has increased and continued application of the same herbicides has happened, the number of species in a population that are resistant to 3 or 4 or 5 has increased. So if the goal is to learn about pesticide resistance management, we have to first understand some fundamental knowledge and theories related to the genetics of resistance. The first online learning modules that I'll discuss through this presentation discusses trait expression and how the process of DNA replication, transcription, and translation can lead to mutations and resistant alleles. So continuing on with some more background, during the Doctor of Plant Health program, we go through 2 internships that we, 2 internships. My first one was an extension education internship with Justin McMecken in entomology. During this internship, I worked on the project with soybean gallmange, and I worked in tracking emergence of the adult and of the larvae, which are these orange larvae pictured in the soybean stem. And I also worked with extension education, spreading the word about this new emerging soybean pest that's in the Midwest. My second internship for the Doctor of Health program was at the Denver Botanic Gardens. And at the Denver Botanic Gardens, I got a chance to work with the public and to work with the staff behind the scenes. I worked in the greenhouse doing integrated pest management techniques and identifying insect pests there. I worked out in the gardens and communicated with the public about science and about what was going on at the gardens. And I also worked in soil testing of the garden's pH as they were increasing the water pH in Denver because of lead pipes. And they were concerned at the gardens that it might affect the buffering capacity of the soil to maintain soil pH. And that leads us to here today with the completion of my Doctor of Plant Health program and the culmination of my learning experiences. Through all the past 6 years, I've learned a lot about learning and understanding the learning process. And I have started seeking to create relatable, relevant, and responsive resources for science communication. So onto the seminar. The learning objectives that I plan to hit while we're talking today is to demonstrate how knowledge from science can be used to support learning and to present a framework to strengthen the design of online learning content. So a quick seminar outline. I'm going to first cover perspectives of learning, what science says about the learning process, and cultivating the learning process to support successful science communication. Beginning with my perspectives of learning that I've developed over the last years in the Doctor of Plant Health program, I've learned that learning is a very complex process and that it's very subjective to the individual, and that it is in fact an innately human ability that we start at birth, and that anyone can participate in science and learning about science. So when do we learn? When are we learning? We're born, like I said, we're born learning. We learn to crawl, we learn to walk, and we're guided by a caretaker on that part of our learning journey. And then we enter grade school and K through 12, and we begin being guided by an educator through the learning experiences as we learn to read and we accumulate knowledge and we go on to graduate high school. But after high school, what are your options for continued education? There are, museums and those types of non-formal learning opportunities. You could go to college or go to technical training schools, but there's a lot of options that you can do beyond that, and there needs to be more opportunities for science learning beyond high school. And that leads us to one of the theories that I read a lot about during this, and that's the lifelong learning theory, which tells us that there's a lifelong pursuit of learning and that a continuous need for knowledge in society, and that learning is not confined to childhood or a certain time or the formal classroom, and that future learning needs of society cannot be supported by current learning means alone. So we can't just support society through going to classes and regular and obtaining a higher degree. So how do I propose that we support the lifelong learning needs of society? In the past, we went to places like the library and would ask a trusted librarian questions. This is an example that I found from the New York Public Library, where they kept some old index cards from the time that we would go to the library to answer questions. This one is a question about wallpaper from 1945, and they're asking, how do I put up wallpaper? I have the paper and I have the paste. What do I do next? Does the paste go on the wall or the paper? I've tried both and it doesn't seem to work. Well, now, if we had that same question, we would just go to the internet and we would YouTube it, we'd Google it, and we might go to like a Home Depot resource on how to put up wallpaper or how to take down old wallpaper. But this tells us that the internet is, in fact, used as a diagnostics tool in our society. And in fact, 85% of adults in the United States go online every day, and 72% of those say that they have looked online for things like health information. So that presents science communication with a wonderful opportunity for continued education and is a resource that we should utilize. So that brings us to the next part of the seminar and what science says about the learning process. So science has been fascinated by the brain and learning for centuries, and there are entire branches of science that are dedicated to learning about learning. One of those is psychology, another is neuroscience, and a third is educational research. And I've used all these three to form a kind of interdisciplinary perspective of learning and how we can support it. So psychology supports learning. And one psychologist that I read a lot was the experiential theorist Kolb. And he published a theory in 1984 about the experiential learning cycle, which starts with a concrete experience where the learner encounters a new experience or will reinterpret an existing one. And during this, the learner's acting as an activist where they feel and do during the learning experience. During the next stage in reflective observation, the learner reflects on the concrete experience on a personal basis, and they're reflecting on that new knowledge that they're gaining and how it relates to them in a personal manner. Next is a abstract conceptualization, where the learner forms new ideas or modifies existing abstract ideas based on that reflection. And they're acting as a theorist and they're thinking and watching during the learning experience. Next, we ask the learner to act as a pragmatist during active experimentation and to test their own ideas that they developed as they're acting as a theorist. During this time, the learner needs to apply the new ideas to see if there are any modifications in the next experience, as the active experimentation leads to more concrete experiences. Another author that I read was a more recent one. Zuhl is a biochemist and researcher, and he mostly studied educational research, but also dabbled in biochemistry and neuroscience. And Zuhl connected Kolb's experiential learning cycle with how the brain functions and the four basic functionings of the brain. And so in this next part, I'll be connecting Kolb's experiential learning cycle to the four pillars that are presented by Zuhl. So in Zuhl's four pillars, learning corresponds with those four major functions of the brain. The first major function is the sensory cortex, where the learner is gathering information, which correlates directly with concrete experience. The next in that is occurs in the back integrative cortex of the brain, and it's when we're reflectively thinking, which corresponds with Kolb's reflective observation. Zuhl's third pillar, creating meaning, occurs in that front integrative cortex and corresponds with abstract conceptualization. And finally, the final pillar is testing ideas during in the motor cortex during active experimentation. So now we're going to take those four pillars that I talked about, and we're going to go into them in a little bit more depth and connect it to cultivating the learning process to support successful science communication. So when we're activating the sensory cortex, we're activating the part of the brain that deals with sight, hearing, taste, scent, touch, and that's the area of the brain that you want to focus on when you're talking about a concrete experience with learners. And we can activate as educators the sensory cortex and support the gathering information stage through firsthand and secondhand experiences. So firsthand learning is that concrete experience where you see it and you can encounter it in person. So that would be if I saw a new beetle and I was studying it, and I can see with my eyes that its coloration and how many legs it has, what its antenna look like, and any hairs that it has or anything else to try and identify it. And if I need more information that's not coming from that firsthand experience, I can go to a secondhand experience. And secondhand learning occurs when we're in active communication with someone and we're talking and listening. It can happen when you're reading a book or you're looking up information online. And firsthand experiences are initiated through that direct sensory input to the brain from the environment. And secondhand experiences are initiated through indirect sensory input to the brain from the environment. So if we want to activate the sensory cortex, it's difficult to do that online. You can't exactly have a student go outside and get an insect and study it, or go out to their garden and collect insects to study it. You kind of have to synthesize that experience, and we can do that through the science of storytelling. Stephen et al. Is a neuroscientist, and he studied the art of storytelling and found that the brain of the storyteller and the listener exhibit similar patterns in neural activity in the same areas of the brain at the same time. So when you're telling a story and someone's listening to the story, the parts of the cortex that light up under fMRI are corresponding with the listener and the talker, and actually begin to reflect each other. So for effective storytelling, I used it in National Needs Fellowship and for the online modules for pesticide resistance management. I tried to create sensory experiences through storytelling in the learning environment. Here's an example of a weed that has spread through a field. I'll let you guys look at it for a moment while I get this up. Yeah, so in my experiences as a learner and educator, the ability to tell the right story at the right time is a useful communication skill. And oh my goodness, we'll just keep going. If a farmer were walking through that field, what would they think? If you look closer at it, you can see that there are dead plants that were treated with herbicide, and you can provide the learner with a story to connect with and concrete experiences to draw from. Here's an example of how that kochia moved through that field as a tumbleweed. And as it span and was moved by the wind, it laid down seed. But how was it able to survive herbicide treatments by that grower? And that's what we're asking the learners to do in the National Needs Fellowship, is we're asking the learner to understand why the ALS herbicide resistant trait was expressed in some families of kochia plants in the farmer's field, but not in others. And that requires us to understand trait expression. So another way to support that first pillar of information gathering and to connect with the learner is to provide learning objectives, which provides a learning roadmap and articulates the skills a learner will gain. And so the question that I'm using to develop my learning objectives are understanding why there is ALS herbicide resistance, and that requires us to understand trait expression. So the learning objectives I developed for the online modules, for the first module, were to first describe a gene and its involvement in the basic steps of trait expression, then to differentiate between the processes of transcription and translation, to reflect on the process of DNA replication and how it relates to mutations, and predict how mutations in genes control resistance to a pesticide. When developing learning objectives, an important tool we can use is Bloom's taxonomy, and that helps us to communicate successfully. The higher up you go in the verb uses of Bloom's taxonomy, the more learning is involved for the learner. So beginning at remember, you're asking the learner to recall facts and basic concepts. Going up to understand, you're asking a learner to explain ideas or concepts, then to apply and analyze, to draw connections among ideas, to evaluate, and to create. And as you move up this pyramid, you are moving the learner along that learning process. So Anderson et al. Used the knowledge types to further develop Bloom's taxonomy. And he used 4 types of knowledge to move these into a chart and to make it a little easier to understand. So the factual knowledge type is the knowledge of terminology and specific details, with an example being knowing a herbicide's site of action or a weed species. A conceptual knowledge type would be like knowledge of classification, principles or theories, and knowledge. An example would be knowing which site of action works for different weed species. A procedural knowledge type would be the knowledge of skills and specific methods and criteria. And an example of that would be knowing selection pressure's role in herbicide resistance. And finally, there's metacognitive knowledge type, which strategic knowledge and self-knowledge. And during this, it would be an example of managing herbicide resistance in your own practice. So moving on to pillar 2, reflective thinking. This occurs in the integrative back cortex, where we stand back from the concrete experience from that first pillar, examine it and think about it. Reflection is the key for learners to transform those concrete experiences into abstract concepts and to move along the learning cycle. When we reflect, we bring it up past experiences and search to create connections. So an example of this would be if I asked everyone in the room to think of an apple. You're going to think of the concrete experience you may have had the last time you ate an apple or saw someone eat an apple or saw it in a movie. You're going to think of what you saw and the color of the apple. You're going to think about maybe the texture if you touched it and it was waxy. You're going to think about what it tastes like, what it sounds like as the person in the office next to you eats a really loud apple. And that all goes into the second pillar as it filters through our brain and gives us like a mental image of what an apple is. There's not a physical apple in this room, but reflectively, we can think of what an apple is and what it looks like. And so that's what we're asking the learner to do. And you can create reflective observation by using dialogue to prompt reflective thinking and meaning. So there's types of dialogue that can be used to prompt reflection. You can increase the depth of knowledge, which requires reflection after activities. You can identify muddiest points, which has the learner reflect on areas that were unclear. You can personalize knowledge, which requires the student to reflect on personal experiences and emotions. And you can also provide comparative references, which ask the learner to reflect on how other people have used the knowledge. So going back to our example from the online modules of the Kochia scoparia, resistant species that spread through this field, reflective dialogue can help prompt the learner to generalize the main idea of the topic and abstract concepts from the experience. And so some of the reflective dialogue that I used in this example was that the farmer is observing the results of biological history that they have been part of developing. The Kochia plant growing in the field the year before possessed a gene that had mutated to create a new version or allele. When this mutant allele was expressed, it encoded a protein that interacts in a different way with the ALS herbicide. This different interaction allowed this plant to survive the herbicide treatment and continue its life and produce hundreds of seeds. After it was no longer alive, its seeds tumbled with it as the wind moved it across the field and distributed those seeds. Many or most of the seeds had inherited the herbicide-resistant allele, and they were able to resist the farmer's herbicide application. And so once again, what we're asking the learners is to understand why the ALS herbicide-resistant trait was expressed in some of the families of Kochia in the field, but not in others. And here's a closer image if you want to see it up closer. You can see all of the new Kochia that has popped up around the field that are also resistant to the herbicide. And it just looks like a big issue for the future of that farmer to control Kochia. Finally, the third pillar is creating meaning, the integrative front cortex of the brain. This is important for the learner to create meaning and have a creative experience. And it's important for the educator to help to create that experience. One way an educator can kind of connect with the learner is through helping them to solve a problem themselves, or when a learner asks a relevant question is asked of the learner. And this type of response when you're working with a student, I know in my experience has been in teaching genetics, when a student's having a hard time understanding a part of trait expression, say they are having a hard time telling the difference between translation and transcription. If I help them solve that problem as opposed to telling them an answer, and that path of working through the problem themselves to get to an answer, and they have that light bulb moment, that light bulb moment is the dopamine. And if we can help students have more of those moments, we can help the learning process be more effective. A way to kind of tap into the resource of things like dopamine or any other emotions is through problem-based learning to engage the learner in content. So Lejeune Kroger is having a problem with the reading room, I think. So in traditional learning, we're told what is needed to understand and memorize it, and a problem is assigned to illustrate how to use that knowledge. In problem-based learning, we're instead presented with a problem, and we're asked to identify what is needed to know, and then to learn, apply, and create a solution to that problem. So a problem could be a big world problem like climate change or environmental degradation or the current COVID-19 pandemic. There are a lot of problems and challenges facing society that we can use to communicate more micro sciences and challenges of knowing what car to buy based on your fuel emissions, or by how much you drive, or a producer knowing what pesticides to be spraying and when, to being in your own backyard and knowing what insect species might be invading it or beneficial to it. And we also encounter learning experiences that need supported in places that we go a lot, like the grocery store. And that moves us to the fourth pillar of testing ideas, where we're motivating action through the neocortex. In the neocortex, the motor area controls the body, and it controls everything from our toes to our arms to our hands to our face and all of the muscles in our body. And so that helps us to activate the motor cortex if we understand how it works. And ways that we can activate the motor cortex for the learner is through having them read and having them communicate and discuss with other learners. And we can also do it through exams and quizzes, having them test the ideas that they've developed along the way. So in conclusion, everybody is learning lifelong, and anybody can participate in science. Learning environments need to engage the four major areas of the neocortex, and the public looks towards online resources to find answers to challenges. So it is necessary that people become empowered to take information from science and apply it to their own lives and communities. And my acknowledgements, thanks to Dr. Hine and my committee members, everybody who attended and has helped me out in my path of the Doctor of Plant Health program. And I'll take any questions. Are there any questions? I'm also looking at the chat just in case.
You're saying when that tumbleweed goes across the prairie, the seeds in it are not already used to the herbicide?
Yeah, so he asked if the tumbleweed that moved through that field, if the seeds were already resistant to the herbicide. And yes, because through their genetics and they inherited that trait from the parent plant that they were on, that they moved on.
In your opinion, what would be best? Spraying or tillage?
To get rid of weeds, there are a lot of options for before you plant, after you plant, whether you're doing a cultural control or you're using a herbicide to control it. But if you are using herbicides, you need to be using multiple modes of action. And if you are thinking tillage. There's tillage beforehand to get rid of the seed bank. And there's options for that. And I got a question in the chat. Just a great job. Thank you, Adam. Yeah, Allie?
What do you think that some of what you presented today can translate into maybe shorter term learning opportunities, like at the grocery store,
Mhm.
as an example? If you don't have a full module and a course that you've set up with objectives,
Yeah.
some of this could translate to this.
Yeah, I think that if I'm thinking specifically at a grocery store, a way that I can think of, and just because we talked about an apple in this, I'm thinking of it, of like ugly fruit. If you have blemished fruit, there's a lot of food waste that goes into that, and that can be a big like challenge if you think globally how much food is wasted. That's something that can be your storyline or your attention grabber of this is how much food is wasted, or this is affecting global warming. Legine entered the waiting room again. And that's my grandma, by the way. That's I think the 4th time she's entered the waiting room. She's having a really rough time. So you can create a storyline if you just have like, a flyer that you can put by the fruit section that says, hey, don't like, just because this has apple scab doesn't mean that it's inedible. It might not look the best, but it's not going to cause any harm to you. And actually there's some studies that have shown that having apple scab increases the nutritional like quantity of the apple. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah, Leah, did you have a question?
Yeah, actually, it was very similar. I think my question is like based on your own personal experience. So teaching in genetics, developing materials, things like that. I guess I'm just curious, like what stuck out to you the most? I mean, as you're, been doing this research and looking at all the different information, neuroscience,
Mhm.
education, and psychology, what's something that stuck out to you the most that maybe you weren't aware of or that you hadn't thought of?
Yeah, I think something that stuck out to me the most with all of this that I've been researching is that a lot of the different disciplines within science that talk about learning, they kind of follow all of the same patterns of you have a learning experience, you have a concrete experience, and that's followed by you have to reflect. And a lot of resources that I looked at really talked about reflection and how important it is to connect to the learner on a personal basis and make content relatable and relevant to them, which means like relatable to them as an individual, which can be hard to do when you're trying to affect a whole community and help them learn about something. But there's ways that you can look at the demographic of an area and predict what type of learner you might be encountering to kind of gear your content towards them better. And but yeah. And there was some chats. Let's go up to Dr. Don Lee asked, does the connectivity we have to the internet reduce the need for UNL to build lecture halls? I think that yes, that we can do a lot more on the internet and through online learning. We can have a huge audience of that. And I don't know if that means less lecture halls, but I know that would mean we could have more parking lots maybe on campus would be nice for people who are coming to campus to learn. Chris asks, learning never stops, but how do you bridge the gap between people who like the wallpaper cards versus the Google users to find and get information? Well, libraries are still very relevant and they haven't disappeared. They might not be writing out their index cards, but I know when I was working on my thesis and everything, I was going to the library and I was using that resource. And I think that that learning online is not for everybody, and it's certainly not something that you can force a person to do if it's not the way that they approach learning. But there are definitely ways that like libraries of themselves can be used as like a hub or a resource for online learning and for in-person learning. Nathan asks, It seems the environment we grew up in and experience sometimes causes biases in what we're willing to learn. Are there methods of teaching designed to overcome bias? Yeah, I think that the most important thing when you're trying to overcome bias is to realize that there's no winning in an opinions, and that when you've grown up with a certain bias and it's not that you're unwilling to learn, it's sometimes that you haven't had those learning experiences. So a way to approach that is trying to connect to the learner on a personal basis and finding out areas that you could fit in information about like science and technology into their daily life that would impact them, instead of coming to them and saying, global warming is happening and we need to fix climate change now or we're all going to die. Well, if you already have like the bias that global warming isn't that big of a deal or that it's not going to impact us in the long run, then you can start by saying, well, okay, maybe you don't care about climate change as like the overall goal, but we can reduce emissions, and also it's you can save so much money getting solar panels. And if you invest in solar panels for a community, then that's jobs. But there's a lot of ways to overcome bias or differences when you're teaching. Another question is, over the years, there seems to be some who are becoming suspicious of science and data. How do you propose reaching those who have gotten a bad taste for science? So on that same line of people having either a prior bias to science or viewing science as not real or as something that is kind of as a conspiracy, I think that that comes from having less. That's kind of like a touchy subject, but a difficult question. I think that, how do you propose reaching those who have gotten a bad taste for science? I think it's just a similar answer to before, where it's about relatability and relevance to them. So what is not relevant to them is coming at them with hard facts and data about so many people believe this or use this, or there's data supporting a certain evidence. A good way to reach those people is through relating to them on a personal basis. Lots of more one-on-one learning conversations than a whole group learning on that. Dr. Lee asks, how fast will the human brain evolve to support human learning? Is it going to function 100 years from now the way it functions now? Well, I'm not really sure of a lot of pressure for human brains to evolve, but maybe, it might evolve in 100 years from the way it functions now. Maybe we'll be able to have like telepathy and connect remotely to a computer, but I don't know if that's more the technology that we have with brainwaves or, but yeah, I don't have the answer to how fast the human brain will evolve. Another question is, how often does the agronomy workforce use the internet in the field to higher level Bloom's thinking and problem solving? Well, I can't say how often we have internet access, like literally in the field, but if we're doing extension education and we're at a center that has access to the internet, we can definitely connect with growers who are at home or who are based somewhere that they can have access to a computer. And those would be opportunities to be able to sit down and move to those higher levels of Bloom's thinking. I wish I could answer the question. Yeah, Casey?
As you study learning, has your effective learning changed?
Yeah, Casey asked if, as I've studied learning, if my effective learning has changed. It has. One thing I learned during this program was that I'm really dyslexic, and that was a learning curve to with all of the reading that I have to do for this, and has been something to overcome. But I think that it's reassuring knowing that learning is such an innate process that it's just something our brain constantly does. But yeah.
That's the end up there. Anybody else have any questions? If not, let's thank Amy again.